Oh my God, it's really gone. How could they?
I can't believe you did this.
It's just a piano, Ma. Get over it.
That was your grandmother's. How could you?
No, it can't be.
Ma'am, I think I have something that belongs to you.
This arrived for you.
No, that's not possible.
The first thing I noticed when I walked into my living room was the empty space. My antique grand piano was gone. For 32 years it had stood beneath the front window, the piano my late husband Robert had saved for months to buy me. Now there were only 4 deep marks in the hardwood floor. When I called my son Daniel, he didn't even sound nervous. "Mom, you never play it anymore. I sold it." 3 days later, a moving truck stopped outside my house. The buyer stepped onto my porch carrying a worn brown envelope. "Mrs. King," he said quietly, "we found this hidden inside your piano." Then he showed me the handwriting on the front. It was Robert's. "For Zoe. If this piano ever leaves her home." Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, if you've ever had someone you love cross a boundary they had no right to cross, please like this video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Sometimes it amazes me how far our stories can travel. The piano had been in our house so long that until the day it disappeared, I had stopped thinking of it as furniture. Furniture could be replaced, that piano could not. I was 68 years old when Daniel sold it, and by then I had lived in the same brick house in Richmond, Virginia for nearly 40 years. Robert and I bought the place when we were young enough to believe a 30-year mortgage sounded like forever. We raised Daniel there. We painted bedrooms, replaced roofs, argued over wallpaper, celebrated Christmas mornings, buried 2 dogs, welcomed neighbors, and watched our son grow from a boy who left muddy sneakers by the back door into a man with a family and business of his own. Robert had been gone 6 years. People sometimes say grief becomes easier with time. I never found that to be exactly true. It becomes quieter. You learn where to put it. Mine lived in small places. In Robert's coffee mug that I could never bring myself to donate. In the indentation on his side of our old leather sofa. And most of all in that piano. Robert bought it for me 32 years before he died. At the time we had no business buying anything antique. Daniel was 9. Our refrigerator made a terrible rattling sound. Robert's pickup truck needed a transmission, and I was teaching piano lessons 3 afternoons a week to help cover household expenses. One Saturday morning, Robert came home unusually excited. "Put your shoes on," he told me. I stared at him from the kitchen. "Why?" "Because I found something." Whenever Robert said that there was a 50-50 chance I was about to see either something wonderful or something completely impractical. This time, it was both. An old family outside Charlottesville was holding an estate sale. In the front room stood a beautiful black grand piano that looked as though it belonged in another century. Its finish was worn in places. One ivory key had a tiny hairline crack. There was a faint scratch along the left side. But when I sat down and played 3 notes, the sound filled the room with such warmth that I stopped talking. Robert watched my face. That was how he knew. "We can't afford it," I whispered. "I know." "Then stop smiling. I'm working on the first problem." He spent months working on that problem. He took extra weekend jobs. He stopped buying lunch at work and packed sandwiches instead. I later learned he had sold an old fishing boat he barely used anymore. By our anniversary, the piano was sitting beneath the front window of our living room. I cried when I saw it. For years afterward, that piano became the heartbeat of our house. I taught children on it. At Christmas, I played carols while Robert sang badly, and Daniel complained that his father was ruining every song. On birthdays, Daniel would sit beside me and hit the final note with one finger, as though he had performed the entire piece himself. When he was 12, he tried lessons. They lasted 7 weeks. "I don't have musical hands," he announced. Robert looked at his fingers and said, "Those look like regular hands to me." Daniel rolled his eyes. I laughed so hard I had to stop the lesson. Those were the memories I heard whenever I looked at that piano. But after Robert died, I stopped playing. At first I told myself it was temporary. Then a month became 6 months. 6 months became a year. Eventually, I stopped opening the lid at all. Still, every Thursday morning, I dusted it. I polished the wood carefully and cleaned between the keys with a soft cloth. It probably seemed ridiculous to anyone else. But grief creates rituals. That was one of mine. Daniel knew what the piano meant to me. At least I believed he did. He was 41 then and ran a small contracting company that handled residential renovations around Richmond. For years, he'd been proud of building something without Robert's help. But during the months before the piano disappeared, Daniel started visiting more often. At first, I was pleased. He would arrive with coffee and ask whether anything needed fixing. A loose cabinet hinge, a porch railing, a bathroom faucet, little things. "You're becoming very attentive in your old age," I teased him one afternoon. "I'm 41, Mom." "Exactly. Ancient." He laughed. But gradually his attention shifted. He began asking questions. Had I ever thought about selling the house? Did I know what homes in my neighborhood were worth? Was Robert's old watch valuable? Had I ever had the dining room furniture appraised? I didn't think much of it. Daniel worked around houses every day. Property values were part of his world. Then one Sunday I found him crouched beside the piano. He had his phone in his hand. "What are you doing?" He startled. "Nothing. People don't usually kneel behind furniture to do nothing." He smiled. "Just looking at the serial number." "Why?" "I was curious how old this thing actually is." "This thing?" "You know what I mean." He took another photograph. I remember standing there with a dish towel over my shoulder watching him. Something inside me tightened. It wasn't fear. Not yet. Just a little discomfort. "Daniel, I'm not selling it." He stood. "I didn't say you were." "Then why are you researching it?" "I'm not researching it. I was curious." He slipped his phone into his pocket and kissed my cheek. "Relax, Mom." I hated that word. Relax. It has a way of making a reasonable question sound unreasonable. But Daniel was my son, so I let it go. A week later, he mentioned the piano again. We were eating sandwiches at my kitchen table when he looked toward the living room. "You know that thing takes up half the room." "It has taken up half the room since you were 9. I'm just saying, if you ever downsized, you'd never fit it into a condo." "I'm not moving into a condo." "Not now. Not later either if I can help it." He smiled, but there was calculation behind it. I recognize that now. I didn't then. "Some antique pianos are worth decent money," he said. "I don't care. You don't even know what it's worth." "I know what it's worth to me." That ended the conversation. Or so I thought. Looking back, I wish I had asked more questions. I wish I had asked why my son suddenly cared about serial numbers and appraisals. I wish I had asked why a man who had always been proud of supporting himself had started studying the things I owned. But mothers have a dangerous habit sometimes. We explain away what frightens us in our children. We call secrecy stress. We call entitlement worry. We call warning signs bad days. And when we love someone, we can become very talented at creating innocent explanations for behavior that isn't innocent at all. 2 days before my piano disappeared, Daniel stopped by again. He stood in the living room for a long time. His hand rested on the curved edge of the piano. "You really don't play anymore," he said. "No." "Doesn't that make you sad?" "Sometimes." "Then why keep it?" I looked at him. "Because not everything has to earn its place by being useful." He didn't answer. His fingers slid slowly across the polished wood. For one strange second, I remembered Robert's voice from the last week of his life. He had been weak then, drifting in and out of sleep. But one evening he had taken my hand and said something that seemed sentimental at the time. "Don't let anyone talk you out of that piano, Zoe." I had smiled. "Who's coming for my piano?" He hadn't smiled back. "Just promise me." So I did. Standing there, 6 years later, watching our son study that same piano, I almost told Daniel about Robert's warning. Almost. Instead, I changed the subject. Daniel left 20 minutes later. Before walking out, he turned once and looked back toward the living room. At the time, I thought he was remembering his father. Only later did I understand that my son wasn't looking at a memory. He was looking at something he had already begun to put a price on. The first time Daniel asked me for $15,000, he did it over coffee. That detail stayed with me because he made the request sound so ordinary. He came by on a Tuesday morning carrying 2 cups from the little coffee shop 3 blocks from my house. Mine was exactly the way I liked it, medium roast, 1 cream, no sugar. He had always remembered little things like that. Maybe that was why the larger things were so difficult for me to see. We sat at the kitchen table, and for several minutes Daniel talked about work. His contracting company had been busy, he said, but 2 clients were late paying invoices. Material costs had risen. A subcontractor had made a mistake on a bathroom renovation that Daniel had been forced to correct at his own expense. Business, he said with a tired smile. Some months you're building houses, other months you're putting out fires. I smiled. Your father used to say something similar. His expression changed slightly. Then he wrapped both hands around his coffee. Actually, Mom, I wanted to ask you something. There are tones your children use that never stop affecting you no matter how old they become. I heard the 9-year-old boy asking permission to stay overnight at a friend's house. What is it? I've got a temporary cash flow problem. How temporary? A few weeks, maybe a month. I waited. He looked down. I need 15,000. I didn't answer immediately. Daniel rushed to fill the silence. It's not like I'm asking you to give it to me. I'd pay you back. I have receivables coming in. I just need enough to cover payroll and a supplier until those checks clear. $15,000 is a lot of money. I know. Does your wife know you're asking me? He hesitated. That was my first warning. Emily knows business has been tight. That's not what I asked. He sighed. No, I haven't told her about this. Why, because she'll worry. Maybe she has a right to know. Daniel leaned back. Mom, I'm not asking for marriage advice. No, you're asking for $15,000. His jaw tightened. I regretted the sharpness immediately, but I didn't take the words back. For most of Daniel's adult life, Robert and I had helped when help seemed reasonable. We contributed toward his first house. We paid for part of his wedding. Robert lent him money when he started the contracting company. But Robert had always insisted on paperwork. Daniel used to complain about it. He's your son, I once told Robert after Daniel left our house irritated over a repayment schedule. Exactly, Robert said. I want him to remain my son instead of becoming my debtor. At the time, I thought Robert was being rigid. 6 years after his death, I finally understood. I can help with 5,000, I told Daniel. But I want you to show me what's happening with the business first. His face fell. 5 isn't enough. It's what I'm comfortable offering. You have more than that sitting in savings. I stared at him. The sentence came too quickly. How do you know what's sitting in my savings? He looked away. I don't know exactly. I'm just saying you're not struggling. That's different. Is it? Yes. He rubbed his forehead. Forget it. Daniel. No, really, forget I asked. He stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. I followed him into the living room. Don't leave angry. I'm not angry. He was. His eyes moved toward the piano. What about selling some things you don't use? I felt something cold move through me. What things? He gestured around the room. You've got a whole house full of stuff. Be specific. His eyes settled on the piano. Of course they did. That, for example. No. You haven't touched it in 6 years. I've already answered this. Mom, you could be sitting on 10 or 15 grand for something that collects dust. And you could be asking permission instead of deciding what my possessions should be worth to me. He stared at me. Then he gave a short laugh. Okay. What does that mean? It means okay, keep the piano. He kissed my forehead before leaving. I'm sorry I asked. I watched him drive away and told myself the disagreement was over. 2 days later, I had a dental appointment across town. It should have taken an hour. Instead, the dentist discovered a cracked crown and sent me to another office for an emergency repair. By the time I stopped at the pharmacy and grocery store afterward, I had been gone nearly 5 hours. I pulled into my driveway shortly after 4. Daniel's truck wasn't there. Nothing looked unusual. I carried 2 grocery bags through the kitchen entrance and put them on the counter. Then I walked toward the living room. I stopped in the doorway. For a few seconds, my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. The front window looked enormous. There was too much light, too much floor. Then I saw the 4 deep impressions in the hardwood. The piano was gone. I dropped my purse. I don't remember dialing Daniel. I only remember hearing his voice. "Hey, Mom." "Where is it?" Silence. "Where is my piano?" Another silence. Then he exhaled. "Mom, don't panic." "Where is it?" "I sold it." My knees weakened. I sat on the nearest chair. "You did what?" "I found a buyer, a legitimate antique dealer. He handles restorations and estate pieces." I could hear my heartbeat. "You sold my piano, Mom, without asking me. You weren't going to sell it." For a moment I couldn't speak. That answer was so astonishing that I almost wondered whether I had misunderstood him. "Exactly," I whispered. "What? I wasn't going to sell it, because it belonged to me." Daniel began talking faster. "You don't use it. You said yourself you haven't played since Dad died. It's just sitting there and the guy offered $12,500. I don't care if he offered 100,000. That's ridiculous. Who bought it?" "Mom, please calm down. Give me his name." Daniel didn't. Instead, he finally told me what I already suspected. He needed the money. A supplier had threatened legal action. Payroll was due. One of his credit lines had been frozen. "I was desperate," he said. "So you stole from me." "I didn't steal anything. What do you call selling something that doesn't belong to you and keeping the money?" "I'm going to pay you back." "That isn't the point. It helped the family." "No, it helped you." The words landed between us. Daniel went quiet. "How much of the money is left?" Another silence. "Daniel." "About 3,500. I closed my eyes. He had already spent $9,000. Less than a day after selling something I had explicitly told him not to touch. "Who bought my piano?" This time he answered. "Michael Turner. He has a restoration workshop outside Richmond." "Call him." "What?" "Call him and get it back." "I can't." "Then I will." "Mom, the transaction is done." "No transaction involving my property is done simply because you decided it was." He sounded exhausted now. "I'll fix it." "You've already done enough." I ended the call. For the next hour, I sat in the living room staring at the empty space. I remembered Christmas music, Daniel's childhood fingers hitting the final note, Robert leaning against the doorway smiling at me. And then another memory surfaced. Robert lying weak in our bedroom 6 years earlier holding my hand. "Don't let anyone talk you out of that piano, Zoe." At the time I had laughed gently. Now there was nothing funny about it. That evening Daniel came to my house. He apologized. Then he explained. Then he justified. Then he apologized again. But I barely heard him, because one question had begun repeating in my mind. Why had Robert warned me about that piano? And why 6 years after his death did I suddenly feel as though Daniel stood in the middle of my living room with his hands in his pockets, occupying the empty space where my piano had been? I couldn't decide whether the sight made me angry or unbearably sad. "I'm sorry," he said again. It was the 4th time in less than 20 minutes. But every apology came with an explanation attached to it, and eventually an apology with enough explanations begins to sound like permission. Someone is trying to give themselves. "I shouldn't have done it without telling you. Without asking me." He frowned. "What? You keep saying you shouldn't have done it without telling me. Telling me would mean you had already decided. You should have asked me." "Fine, without asking you." "And I would have said no." "That's why I didn't ask." There it was. The truth. I looked at my 41-year-old son and felt something shift inside me. "You knew exactly what you were doing." "Mom, I was desperate." Desperate people still know the difference between theirs and someone else's. He turned toward the window. Outside, late afternoon traffic moved quietly along our street. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower started. The ordinary sounds made the conversation feel even stranger. Daniel finally faced me again. "I can get the money back." "You told me you've already spent $9,000. "I'll replace it." "When?" He hesitated. when those invoices come in. And if they don't, they will. That isn't an answer. He rubbed both hands over his face. I came here to apologize, not get interrogated. And I didn't invite you here to sell my belongings. His hands dropped. For the first time, anger flashed across his face. You weren't using it. I stared at him. I beg your pardon. The piano. You weren't using it. You haven't played since Dad died. That doesn't make it yours. I didn't say it did. You acted as though it did. He paced toward the fireplace. Mom, it was sitting there collecting dust while my business was about to miss payroll. People work for me. People have families. I had to make a decision. You had to make a decision about your business. You did not have to make one about my piano. Do you hear yourself? Perfectly. It's a piece of furniture. No. He laughed bitterly. That's exactly the problem. Everything in this house has become some sacred memorial to Dad. The words hurt more than I expected. Daniel must have seen it because his expression softened. I didn't mean it like that. Then how did you mean it? He didn't answer. I walked to the 4 marks in the floor and looked down at them. For 32 years, that piano stood right here. I know. Your father bought it for me. I know. You took lessons on it. 7 terrible weeks. Normally, that memory would have made me smile. It didn't. You played Christmas songs with me. Mom. You knew what it meant. I knew what it meant when Dad was alive. I turned toward him. And you decided his death changed who owned it. No. Then stop explaining. Daniel's face hardened again. I thought Dad would have understood. That stopped me. What? If he were here and knew what was happening with the company, he would have helped me. Your father helped you many times. Exactly. But he never stole from me to do it. Daniel flinched. I didn't steal from you. You sold something I owned without permission, took the money and spent it. I'll repay you. You keep talking about money because money is easier than what you actually did. What do you want me to say? I want you to call Michael Turner and tell him the truth. Daniel shook his head immediately. No. Why? Because I'll look like a criminal. I let the silence answer him. His expression changed. Seriously. You said it, not me. Mom, come on. Call him. The sale is done. Then undo it. I can't just undo it. You managed to arrange it quickly enough. Daniel looked towards the floor. I realized there was something else. How long had you been planning this? He didn't respond. Daniel. A couple of days. My stomach tightened. So when you were standing beside the piano asking why I kept it, you were already thinking about selling it. I was considering options. My possessions were your options. He exhaled sharply. Can we stop talking like I'm some stranger who broke into your house? Right now, I'm trying to understand why my son believed being my son gave him rights a stranger wouldn't have. That silenced him. I sat down. Give me the $12,500. I told you can all of it. I don't have all of it. Then give me what's left. Daniel stared at me. I need that for payroll. It's my money. Mom. My money, Daniel. His jaw worked as though he were swallowing words. Finally, he pulled out his phone. I can transfer $3,500 tonight. And the rest? I'll make payments. To me? Yes. And Michael? What about him? He bought property from someone who didn't own it. Daniel looked irritated. He paid for it in good faith. Which is exactly why you need to tell him. If you contact him, this could become a legal mess. Perhaps you should have considered that. He turned away. Then he said something I would remember for a very long time. It was going to be mine someday anyway. The room seemed to become completely still. I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. What did you say? Daniel closed his eyes. I didn't mean, say it again. I was frustrated. Say it again. He looked at me. I said it would have been mine someday. There was no shouting after that. I think shouting would have been easier. I studied my son's face and suddenly understood that we were no longer discussing a piano. Daniel had begun looking at my belongings as his future belongings. My house, my savings, my furniture. Perhaps even the life Robert and I had built together. Things he believed were simply waiting for me to finish using them. "I'm still alive," I said quietly. His face fell. "Mom, that's not what I meant." "It may not be what you intended to say, but it is what you said." "I'm sorry." I walked toward the window. Across the room, the empty floor seemed almost accusatory. Then Robert's warning returned to me with such clarity that I could practically hear his voice. "Don't let anyone talk you out of that piano, Zoe." I turned back. "There's something your father said before he died that I never told you." Daniel looked up. "What?" "He made me promise not to let anyone convince me to sell that piano." Daniel blinked. "Why? I don't know." "He probably knew how sentimental you'd be." "Maybe." What else could it mean? That was the question. Robert had been sick, but his mind had still been clear when he said it. And he hadn't sounded sentimental. He had sounded serious. "Did Dad say something was inside it?" Daniel asked. "No." "Did he say it was valuable?" "No." "Then you're reading too much into it." Perhaps I was. But Robert had spent 43 years beside me. I knew the difference between one of his casual comments and something he wanted remembered. He had made me promise. And now the one object he had specifically told me to protect was gone. Daniel left shortly after. Before walking out, he promised again that he would repay the money. I didn't answer. That night I barely slept. The house sounded different without the piano. Too open, too empty. The next morning I searched through Robert's old files. Insurance papers, receipts, estate documents. I found nothing explaining the piano. By the second night, I began wondering whether grief was making me imagine a mystery where none existed. Then on the third morning after Daniel sold it, I heard the low rumble of a truck outside. I moved to the front window. A moving truck had stopped at the curb. 2 men climbed out. Then I saw Michael Turner, and behind him, carefully secured inside the truck, was my piano. Michael walked toward my porch carrying something in one hand, a worn brown envelope. When I opened the door, he didn't introduce himself immediately. He simply looked at me and asked, "Mrs. King?" "Yes." His eyes dropped to the envelope. "I think we found something your husband intended you to have." My heart stopped. Then he turned it toward me. Across the front in handwriting I had known for more than 40 years were 9 words. "For Zoe. If this piano ever leaves her home." For several seconds I couldn't reach for the envelope. Michael Turner stood on my porch holding it carefully by the edges, as though he understood that whatever was inside mattered more than the paper itself. I stared at the handwriting. Robert's capital Z always leaned slightly to the right. His lowercase f looked almost like a printed letter. There was no possibility of mistake. My husband had written those words. "For Zoe. If this piano ever leaves her home." "Where did you find this?" I whispered. Michael glanced toward the moving truck. "Inside the piano." "Inside, not under the lid, not anywhere you'd normally look." I stepped aside. "Please come in." Michael entered the living room and immediately looked toward the empty space beneath the window. "I assume that's where it was. For 32 years. He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For being involved in this." "You didn't know?" "No, ma'am, I didn't." Michael appeared to be in his early 60s with silver at his temples and the rough hands of someone who had spent years working with wood. Daniel had described him as an antique dealer, but Michael explained that restoration was actually most of his business. He bought older instruments, furniture, and architectural pieces, restored what could be saved, and occasionally resold them. "Your son contacted me about 10 days ago," he said. 10 days. That number struck me immediately. Daniel had claimed he had been considering selling my piano for only a couple of days. "He contacted you 10 days before the sale." Michael nodded. "He sent photographs first." "What kind of photographs?" "Full exterior, keyboard, legs, manufacturer markings, serial number." The serial number. I remembered finding Daniel crouched beside the piano with his phone. He hadn't been curious. He had been preparing a sale. I sat down. Michael noticed my expression. "Mrs. King, I'm fine." I wasn't. But I wanted the truth more than I wanted comfort. What did Daniel tell you? Michael hesitated. He said the piano had belonged to his father and that the family was clearing out some things after a death. My husband died 6 years ago. Michael's mouth tightened. I know that now. What else? He said his mother had stopped playing and was downsizing. I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, because sometimes a lie is so complete that your mind has nowhere else to put the shock. I told Daniel I'm not moving. Michael looked uncomfortable. I asked him directly whether he had authority to sell it. And he said yes. Did he say it belonged to him? He said it was a family piece and he was handling the sale. That was clever. Not quite a direct lie, just enough truth arranged in the wrong order. How did you find the envelope? Michael sat across from me. When we got the piano to my workshop, I started doing an inspection. I wasn't planning a full restoration immediately, but there was something unusual about the underside. What? A panel. He explained that older grand pianos sometimes accumulated repairs and modifications over decades. Most were obvious to an experienced restorer. This one wasn't. There was a thin wooden panel beneath the lower structure that didn't match the original construction, he said. Same type of wood stained carefully but newer. How much newer? Hard to say, maybe 20 or 30 years. Robert. I knew before Michael said anything else. Robert had done it. My technician noticed 2 screws had different heads from the others, Michael continued. We removed the panel because I wanted to make sure there wasn't structural damage underneath. And the envelope was there. Behind it was a narrow compartment, purpose-built. Someone had made it deliberately. My hands had started trembling. Was there anything else? No, just that. Michael nodded toward the envelope. I didn't open it. Thank you. The message on the outside was enough to make me uncomfortable. He paused. So I called Daniel. My eyes lifted. When? Yesterday. What did he say? He told me it was probably an old note and that I should throw it away. I felt something inside me go cold. He told you to throw it away. Yes. Did you tell him what was written on it? I read the exact words. For Zoe. If this piano ever leaves her home. Daniel had heard those words and told Michael to destroy the envelope. That hurt differently from the sale itself. Selling the piano could be explained by panic, greed, desperation. But asking someone to throw away a message addressed to me by my dead husband, that required a choice. What did you do? I told him I wouldn't destroy something addressed to another person. Michael leaned forward. Then I asked for your phone number. He gave it to you. No. Of course he hadn't. He said you were elderly and easily confused about paperwork. My breath caught. Michael continued quickly. That was when I knew I needed to stop everything. I looked toward the window. Elderly and confused. I'm sorry. I'm 68, Mr. Turner. I occasionally forget where I leave my reading glasses. I have not forgotten who owns my piano. A faint smile touched his face. I gathered that. He explained that he had located my address through the original pickup paperwork. Then he made a decision that I will always remember with gratitude. He loaded the piano back onto his truck. What about the $12,500? I'll deal with Daniel. You already paid him. Yes. I can't ask you to take that loss. You're not asking. But, Mrs. King, I buy property from legal owners. If someone sells me something they don't own, I don't get to keep it just because I paid the wrong person. He stood. The piano belongs here until the ownership issue is resolved properly. I looked at him for a long moment. Thank you. He nodded. Let's get it back inside. 20 minutes later, the piano stood beneath my front window again. The movers positioned it almost exactly where it had been. When they left, I placed my palm on the polished wood. 3 days. It had been gone only 3 days. Yet I felt as though something had returned from another lifetime. Michael remained near the doorway. The envelope, he reminded me gently. I had almost forgotten I was still holding it. Would you like someone here when you open it? No. Then I reconsidered. Actually, stay. I sat on the piano bench. The paper was brittle at the corners. Robert had sealed the flap with tape that had yellowed with age. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside were two things. The first was a folded letter. The second was a small brass key. A white identification tag was attached to it. There was a number printed on the tag, but no explanation. I unfolded the letter. The first line nearly broke me. My dear Zoe, if you're reading this, then the piano has left our home. I pressed my fingers against my mouth. Michael quietly turned toward the window, giving me privacy without leaving. I kept reading. Robert's handwriting filled 2 pages. He wrote that years earlier, during repairs to the piano, he had discovered enough empty space beneath the frame to create a small compartment. He had hidden the envelope there himself. But what came next confused me. There are 2 reasons you might be holding this letter he had written. The first is that you chose freely and happily to let the piano go. If that's true, sweetheart, then smile at my foolish precautions and continue with your life. I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like Robert. Then I read the next paragraph. The second reason is that someone made that decision for you. My smile disappeared. If that happened, Zoe, don't rush to forgive simply because you love the person who did it. Slow down. Understand what happened first. Love can make you generous. It can also make you surrender things you never meant to give away. I stopped reading. My vision blurred. Michael glanced toward me, but said nothing. At the bottom of the first page, Robert had written one final instruction. The key in this envelope belongs to a safe deposit box at Commonwealth Trust Bank. Before you open it, call Margaret Ellis. She'll know what to do. I stared at the little brass key resting in my palm. Margaret Ellis had been our family attorney for nearly 25 years. I hadn't spoken to her in more than a year. I turned the page. There were only 3 lines, and one of them made my hands begin trembling again. Whatever happened, don't let guilt make your next decision. You are allowed to protect the life we built. Always yours, Robert. I pressed the letter against my chest. For 6 years I had believed Robert's warning about the piano was sentiment. Now I knew better. My husband hadn't been protecting an instrument. He had been waiting for something. And somehow, years before Daniel ever sold my piano, Robert had feared that one day someone I loved might decide that what belonged to me was theirs to take. I looked down at the brass key, then I reached for my phone. It was time to call Margaret Ellis. Margaret Ellis answered on the 3rd ring. Ellis. Her voice had not changed. It was calm, clipped, and unmistakably professional. The same voice I remembered from the conference room where Robert and I had signed our estate documents years earlier. Margaret, it's Zoe King. There was a brief pause. Zoe, it's good to hear from you. I found something Robert left for me. Another pause. This one felt different. What did you find? A letter. I looked at the brass key in my palm. And a key? Margaret said nothing. Robert told me to call you before I used it. This time the silence lasted so long that I pulled the phone away from my ear to make sure the call hadn't disconnected. Margaret, I'm here. You know what this is, don't you? Does the key have a numbered white tag? I stared at it. Yes. She exhaled slowly. Then yes. My heart began beating harder. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because Robert specifically instructed me not to. I stood and walked toward the window. The piano was back where it belonged. Michael had left half an hour earlier after making me promise to call if I needed documentation regarding the sale. Margaret, my husband, has been dead for 6 years. I know. And you've known about this for 6 years. Longer. That answer unsettled me. How much longer? I'd rather discuss that in person. Why? Because if Robert's instructions have been triggered, I need to see exactly what he left you before I say anything else. Triggered. I hated the word. It made my marriage sound like a legal mechanism. What instructions? Zoe, bring the letter and key to my office tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. I want to know what's happening. And you will. Margaret. Did Robert tell you to trust me? I looked down at the letter. Call Margaret Ellis. She'll know what to do. Yes. Then trust me until tomorrow. After we hung up, I sat beside the piano for nearly an hour. I read Robert's letter again. And again. Each time different words stood out. Someone made that decision for you. Don't rush to forgive. Understand what happened first. You are allowed to protect the life we built. I wanted Robert beside me so badly that the wanting became physical. I wanted to ask him what he had known. I wanted to complain that he should have told me. Mostly, I wanted to hear him say my name. Instead, the phone rang. Daniel. I watched it until it stopped. A minute later, he called again. Then came a text. Mom, Michael says you have the piano back. We need to talk. I didn't respond. Another message arrived. Please don't make this bigger than it needs to be. I stared at those words. 3 days earlier, I might have called immediately. I would have heard the anxiety beneath Daniel's defensiveness and tried to calm him. That was what I had always done. When Daniel was 17 and wrecked Robert's truck, I stood between father and son and softened the argument. When he was 26 and ran up credit card debt, I quietly gave him money so Emily wouldn't worry. When his business struggled during its first year, I convinced Robert to extend the repayment schedule on his startup loan. I had called those things love. Perhaps they were. But Robert's letter had forced me to consider another possibility. Maybe love could become a habit of removing consequences. And maybe Daniel had learned to expect that habit. The next morning, I arrived at Margaret's office 15 minutes early. Her practice occupied the second floor of a renovated brick building near downtown Richmond. Margaret was 71 now, with silver hair cut neatly at her chin and the same dark-framed glasses she'd worn for years. When I entered her office, she didn't greet me with small talk. She looked at the envelope in my hand. May I? I passed it across the desk. She read the outside first, then the letter. When she finished, she removed her glasses. So it happened. What happened? Someone took the piano without your permission. My son sold it. Margaret's expression barely changed, but I saw sadness in her eyes. Daniel. Yes. Why? Debt. I explained everything. The $15,000 request, the photographs, the sale, the $9,000 already spent, Michael's discovery, and Daniel's statement that the piano would have belonged to him someday anyway. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded Robert's letter carefully. There's something you need to understand about your husband. I thought I understood him pretty well after 43 years. You did? Then why am I sitting here with a secret key? A small smile appeared. Because Robert worried that you understood everyone else's needs better than your own. That sounded irritatingly like him. What is in the box? I don't know everything. You just said, I know why it exists. I don't know every document Robert eventually placed inside it. I leaned back. Start with why. Margaret folded her hands. About 9 years before Robert died, Daniel came to him asking for money. I frowned. Daniel asked us for money more than once. This was different. How? He wanted Robert to guarantee a commercial loan. I remembered something vaguely. Daniel had been considering expanding the company around then, but Robert told me the plan hadn't worked out. Robert said no. Yes. Why? Because Daniel wanted to secure part of the loan against assets he expected to inherit eventually. My stomach tightened. What assets? Primarily your house. I stared at her. He couldn't do that. No, but the way he spoke about it disturbed Robert. I heard Daniel's voice from 3 nights earlier. It was going to be mine someday anyway. Apparently that idea wasn't new. Why didn't Robert tell me? Because Daniel backed away from the plan, and Robert didn't want to damage your relationship with him over something that hadn't actually happened. So instead he hid a key in my piano. Not immediately. Margaret leaned forward. Robert spent the next several years reorganizing certain estate protections. He wasn't trying to punish Daniel. He wanted to make sure that if he died first, no one could pressure you into treating your assets as an advance inheritance. I felt suddenly cold. Did Robert think Daniel would steal from me? No. Her answer was immediate. He believed Daniel loved you. That isn't an answer. It's the most important answer. Margaret paused. Robert believed Daniel's weakness wasn't cruelty, it was panic. When Daniel felt trapped financially, he became very good at convincing himself that whatever solved the immediate problem was justified. I looked toward the window. That description was painfully accurate. He also worried about you, Margaret continued. Me. Robert once told me Zoe can say no to anyone except someone she loves who's hurting. Tears burned behind my eyes. The sentence sounded so much like my husband that I had to look away. So what do we do now? Margaret placed the key beside Robert's letter. We go to Commonwealth Trust Bank. Today. Today. She stood and reached for her coat. 25 minutes later, we entered the marble lobby of the bank. Margaret handled the paperwork. I signed 2 forms. A bank officer led us through a secured door and down a quiet corridor to the safe deposit vault. He checked the number on my key. Then he located the box. It was longer than I expected. He placed it on a private viewing table and left us alone. For a moment, neither Margaret nor I touched it. "Are you ready?" she asked. "No." She gave me a gentle look. Neither was Robert when he prepared this. I inserted the brass key. The lock turned. Inside were no stacks of money, no jewelry, no gold, just documents, a thick folder, an appraisal, several photographs, and another sealed envelope. I picked up the appraisal first. At the top was a photograph of my piano. My eyes moved toward the figure printed near the bottom. Insurance replacement value, $85,000. I looked at Margaret. Daniel sold it for $12,500. I see that. But why would Robert hide this? Margaret didn't answer. She had picked up another document. Her expression had changed. What is it? She turned the first page toward me. Across the top were the words, King Family Trust Amendment. Margaret, she looked at me for a long moment. Then she said quietly, Zoe, Robert wasn't protecting the piano. She placed her finger on the document. He was protecting you. I stared at the words, King Family Trust Amendment, until they began to blur. What does that mean? I asked. Margaret pulled out the chair beside me. Sit down. I am sitting. No, you're halfway out of your chair. I looked down and realized she was right. My body had gone rigid without my noticing. I settled back while Margaret arranged the documents across the private viewing table. The piano appraisal remained on my left, $85,000. I still couldn't understand it. Please start with the piano, I said. How can it be worth that much? Margaret handed me the appraisal. This was completed 11 years ago. I turned the pages. There were photographs of details I had never paid attention to, the legs, the soundboard, the internal frame, the manufacturer's mark, even the tiny crack in one ivory key. According to the report, the piano had been built in the early 20th century and was one of a relatively limited production series. More importantly, documentation Robert had obtained connected it to a prominent Virginia family whose estate history could be traced for generations. Provenance, Margaret said. Documented ownership history can matter significantly with antiques. But Robert bought it at an estate sale. Yes, and apparently he kept every document associated with that sale. I shook my head. He never told me. Did you ever ask what it was worth? No. Then perhaps he didn't think the number mattered. That sounded like Robert. He had never been impressed by expensive things. When we bought our first new car, he spent more time admiring the warranty than the leather seats. I continued reading. The $85,000 figure wasn't necessarily what someone would pay tomorrow. It was an insurance replacement estimate based on proper restoration rarity and documented history. Still, Daniel had sold it for a fraction of that amount. He didn't even know what he was selling, I whispered. No. And neither did I. Margaret looked at me. Which is exactly why value doesn't determine ownership. I met her eyes. If the piano had been worth $500, Daniel still had no right to sell it. Correct. That mattered. I didn't want the story to become about money. Daniel hadn't betrayed me because the piano happened to be valuable. He had betrayed me because he had taken the decision away from me. I placed the appraisal aside. Now the trust. Margaret opened the amendment. Robert and you created the original King Family Trust 14 years ago. I remember. It was fairly standard. The house investment accounts and certain other assets were placed under the trust structure. You and Robert were co-trustees. And after he died, I became trustee. Correct. So what changed? Robert became concerned about what might happen if you were pressured financially after his death. By Daniel. Margaret hesitated. Primarily. The word hurt. Tell me everything. She turned to a marked section. After Daniel approached Robert about guaranteeing that commercial loan, Robert asked me what rights an adult beneficiary had while the grantors were still alive. None, I assume. Essentially none unless the trust says otherwise. But Robert wasn't worried about Daniel's legal rights. He was worried about emotional pressure. I almost smiled bitterly. He knew me. Very well. Margaret explained that the amendment clarified control over the house, our primary investment portfolio, and several designated assets. As surviving trustee, I controlled them. Daniel could not pledge them. He could not borrow against them. He could not authorize their sale. He could not represent himself as having a current ownership interest. His status as a future beneficiary gave him no present control. So even if Daniel somehow convinced a lender that he'll inherit the house, he cannot use that expectation as collateral through the trust. And if I wanted to sell the house myself, you can. If I wanted to spend the money, within the trust terms, yes. If I wanted to move to California and buy a ridiculous pink convertible, Margaret finally laughed. I would advise sunscreen. For the first time that morning, I laughed too. It lasted only a few seconds. Then the sadness returned. Robert thought this was necessary. Margaret's expression softened. He thought clarity was necessary. That's a lawyer's answer. Then here's the answer from someone who knew your husband for 25 years. She closed the folder. Robert loved Daniel. He was proud of him. But he understood something about your son that I think you have spent years trying not to see. I said nothing. When Daniel becomes frightened, particularly about money, he starts treating the future as if it already belongs to him. The sentence landed hard. It was going to be mine someday anyway. I looked down at my hands. Did Robert ever think Daniel would sell my piano? No. Then why hide the key there? Margaret considered the question. Because the piano was the one thing Robert believed you would never voluntarily surrender under pressure. I looked at her. If it disappeared without your choice, Robert believed that would mean a boundary had been crossed. Suddenly, the strange instructions made sense. The piano wasn't the treasure chest, it was the alarm. Robert had chosen something deeply personal to me as a signal. If someone could persuade me or force me to surrender, that then perhaps I was already being pressured about other things. I reached for the sealed envelope inside the box. It had my name on it. Another letter. Margaret nodded. I believe so. I opened it. Robert's handwriting greeted me again. Zoe, if you've reached this box because someone treated your future as their property, please remember something I learned too late in life. A promised inheritance is not permission to spend the living person's life. I stopped. Margaret waited. I continued. Help Daniel when help makes him stronger. Do not help him when help only makes it easier for him to avoid becoming stronger. Love him, but never finance the part of him that refuses to grow. I closed my eyes. There was no anger in Robert's words. That made them more painful. He hadn't written them as a father rejecting his son. He had written them as a father who understood him. I folded the letter carefully. Margaret, has Daniel contacted you recently? Her face changed. It was subtle, but I saw it. What? Why are you asking? Because Daniel didn't suddenly decide to sell my piano. I thought about the photographs, the serial number, the questions about my house, my savings, my furniture. He was looking for money before he touched the piano. Margaret removed her glasses. Zoe, has he contacted you? She was silent. That silence answered me. About 2 months ago. My stomach tightened. What did he want? He asked a general question about the trust. What question? Margaret chose her words carefully. He wanted to know whether you could use the house as collateral for a business loan. I stared at her. He asked you that? Yes. Did he say I wanted to do it? No. What exactly did he say? He said he was exploring financial options and wanted to understand whether the trust prevented you from borrowing against the property. And what did you tell him? That I couldn't discuss your estate planning with him without your authorization. I stood and walked to the far side of the small room. 2 months. Daniel had been thinking about my house for 2 months. The piano had not been his first idea. It had simply been the first asset he could physically take. Did he ask anything else? Margaret hesitated again. Daniel asked whether being your only child gave him any authority as a future beneficiary. I felt the air leave my lungs. What did you say? I told him no. The safe deposit box sat open behind me. Documents, appraisals, trust amendments, warnings from a dead husband who had understood a danger I had spent years refusing to name. I had entered that bank thinking I was going to discover why Robert had protected an antique piano. Instead, I discovered that the piano was almost irrelevant. Robert had been protecting my right to remain the owner of my own life, and now I needed to find out exactly how far my son had been willing to go before that piano ever left my house. I left Commonwealth Trust Bank carrying copies of documents I had not known existed and a question I was almost afraid to answer. How long had Daniel been planning around my money? Margaret drove us back to her office because I didn't trust myself to concentrate behind the wheel. For most of the ride, Richmond passed outside the window unnoticed. At a traffic light, Margaret glanced at me. You're very quiet. I'm counting. Counting what? Every conversation Daniel and I have had in the last 6 months. The questions had seemed harmless when they happened. Had I thought about downsizing? What was the house worth now? Did Robert leave investments? Was the antique furniture insured? Had I considered changing banks? At the time, each question had existed separately. Now they connected. Maybe I'm being unfair, I said. Margaret didn't answer immediately. That's possible. I looked at her. You don't sound convinced. My job isn't to decide Daniel's motives. It's to help you protect your interests while you determine the facts. There it was again. The difference Robert had tried to teach me. Facts first. Forgiveness later. At Margaret's office, she made coffee while I reread Robert's second letter. Love him. Help him when help makes him stronger. But never finance the part of him that refuses to grow. I traced my finger over the words. Robert knew I would rescue Daniel. Margaret set a cup beside me. He knew you would want to. Is there a difference? A very large one. I looked toward her. She sat across from me. Zoe, do you remember when Daniel was 26 and had that credit card problem? My face warmed. How do you know about that? Robert told me. I paid those cards. I know. Daniel paid me back. Eventually. I frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying Robert began worrying about a pattern long before the commercial loan. I remembered that year. Daniel and Emily had been newly married. They had bought furniture they couldn't afford, taken a vacation on credit, and then faced an unexpected medical bill. Daniel called me embarrassed. I paid nearly $11,000. Robert was furious when he found out. Not because we couldn't afford it, because I hadn't required Daniel to change anything. You always thought Robert was too hard on him, Margaret said. Sometimes he was. Perhaps. She wasn't defending Robert blindly. That was one reason I trusted Robert was too hard on him, Margaret said. Sometimes he was. Perhaps. She wasn't defending Robert blindly. That was one reason I trusted her. But Robert told me something after Daniel asked him to guarantee the business loan. What? He said, every time Daniel runs toward a wall, Zoe moves the wall. I looked down. The sentence hurt because I recognized myself in it. What was I supposed to do? Watch my child fail? Maybe sometimes. I looked sharply at her. Margaret didn't flinch. Failure isn't always destruction. That silenced me. For years I had treated the two as if they were the same. If Daniel couldn't make a payment, I helped. If his business struggled, I helped. If he and Emily faced an unexpected expense, I helped. Each individual decision seemed loving, but perhaps Daniel had learned something I never intended to teach him. When the consequences became frightening enough, his mother would make them disappear. I opened the trust amendment again. Explain this to me without lawyer language. Margaret smiled faintly. All right, she pointed to the document. The Richmond house remains under your control as surviving trustee. Daniel has no authority over it. Even though he's the beneficiary later. Correct. My investments. Same principle. Could he borrow against them? No. Sell them? No. No. Use his expected inheritance to force me to do anything? Absolutely not. What if I spend every penny before I die? Margaret raised one eyebrow. Planning something exciting. Despite myself, I smiled. No. Then legally, the important point is this: Daniel's future interest does not make your present life his asset. I thought of Robert's letter. A promised inheritance is not permission to spend the living person's life. My husband had built the same message into both the legal documents and his final words. Why didn't Robert just remove Daniel as beneficiary? Because he didn't want to. Margaret's answer was immediate. He loved his son. He wanted Daniel to inherit whatever remained someday. Then what was he protecting me from in pressure? She paused. And perhaps protecting Daniel from himself. That surprised me. How? If easy access to your assets could rescue every financial mistake, Daniel might never be forced to change the behavior creating those mistakes. I looked toward the folder containing the piano appraisal. Daniel had sold an $85,000 instrument for $12,500 because he needed money immediately. He hadn't researched carefully. He hadn't considered restoration value. He hadn't even confirmed legal ownership. He had seen a problem and grabbed the nearest solution, exactly as Margaret described. There's something else, I said. What? Michael told me Daniel contacted him 10 days before the sale. Margaret frowned. Daniel told you he'd only considered selling it for a couple of days. Yes. So he lied. I nodded. And Michael said Daniel told him I was downsizing. Margaret leaned back. Are you? No. Have you discussed moving? Daniel has. I haven't. And Daniel told Michael he was authorized to handle the sale? Yes. Margaret's expression became more serious. Keep a record of everything. I'm not suing my son. I didn't say you were. I don't want the police involved. I didn't say that either. Then why document it? Because memory becomes surprisingly flexible when families become frightened. I knew exactly what she meant. Daniel had already changed the story several times. First, the piano was useless. Then selling it helped the family. Then Robert would have wanted it. Then it would eventually belong to Daniel anyway. Each explanation appeared only after the previous one failed. My phone vibrated. Daniel. This time I answered. Mom. His voice sounded exhausted. We need to talk. Yes, we do. Michael is demanding the money back. He should. I don't have it. I know. Can you please tell him you'll let the sale stand? No. Silence. Mom, listen to me. If I have to return 12.5 immediately, I'm in serious trouble. You are already in serious trouble. This could destroy the company. Then tell me the truth. I have told you the truth. No, Daniel, you've told me pieces. He became quiet. I continued. You contacted Michael 10 days before the sale. Nothing. You photographed the serial number for him. Still nothing. You told him I was downsizing. Mom. And 2 months ago you called Margaret Ellis. The silence changed. It was no longer defensive. It was frightened. Why were you talking to Margaret? She had no right to tell you that. She's my attorney. I asked a hypothetical question. About using my house as collateral for your business. I was exploring options. Without telling me. I hadn't done anything. Yet. He inhaled sharply. What is that supposed to mean? It means the piano wasn't your first plan. Mom, you're making this sound sinister. I'm asking whether my property became part of your business plan before I even knew your business was failing. He didn't answer. That was enough. Come to my house tomorrow morning, I said. Why? Because I want the entire truth. I have jobs tomorrow. Then move them. Mom. Daniel, you sold my piano after I told you not to. You contacted my attorney about my house without telling me. You described yourself as having authority you did not have. My voice remained calm. That surprised both of us. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. He finally said fine. After the call ended, Margaret studied me. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. And for once, that uncertainty didn't frighten me. Because I finally understood something Robert had been trying to tell me from the grave. I didn't need to decide whether to forgive Daniel tomorrow. I didn't need to decide whether he was a good son or a bad one. I didn't even need to decide what our relationship would become. I needed only one thing, the truth. And after that, Daniel would have to face whatever the truth required. Daniel arrived at 10:17 the next morning. Normally, I would have noticed the 17 minutes. That morning, I noticed something else first. He looked tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of a man who had been working long hours. His face seemed thinner, his eyes shadowed, and his shirt looked as though he had pulled it from a chair instead of a closet. For one dangerous second, I wanted to forget everything and ask whether he had eaten breakfast. That was my instinct. Feed him, comfort him, fix whatever hurt. Then I remembered Robert's letter. Help him when help makes him stronger. I opened the door. Come in. Daniel walked directly into the living room. When he saw the piano beneath the window, he stopped. Michael's movers had returned it almost perfectly to its old position. Daniel stared at it. So it's back. Yes. Did he damage it? No. He gave a bitter little laugh. Good. At least somebody's happy. I closed the front door. Sit down. Mom, I don't have all day. Neither did I when you sold my piano. His jaw tightened, but he sat. I took the chair across from him. Between us was the coffee table where I had placed a yellow legal pad. Daniel noticed it. What's that? Something I should have used months ago. He leaned back. You're taking notes. I'm trying to understand what happened. You already know what happened. No. I know you sold my piano for $12,500 and spent $9,000 of it. I know you contacted Michael before you asked me for money. I know you contacted Margaret about my house. His eyes shifted. What I don't know is why. I told you, cash flow. How much? What? How bad is it? He looked toward the piano. Daniel. It's complicated. Then simplify it. He rubbed his palms together. I owe people money. How much? A lot. How much? He stood. This is exactly why I didn't want to do this. Sit down. I'm 41 years old. Then answer like a 41-year-old man. He stared at me. I had never spoken to him that way. Perhaps I had never needed to. Or perhaps I had needed to many times and refused. Daniel sat again. About 140,000. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood. $140,000. Approximately. My stomach dropped. You told me you needed 15,000. That's what I needed immediately. For payroll, partly. What else? A supplier. What else? He looked away. Equipment payments. What else? A line of credit. I closed my eyes briefly. Does Emily know? Not all of it. How much does she think you owe? Maybe 40. I stared at him. Your wife thinks your business owes $40,000, and the real number is almost 100,000 more. It's not all due tomorrow. That isn't the point. I know. No, Daniel, I'm beginning to think you don't. He stood again and walked toward the fireplace. I let him. After a moment, he started talking. A renovation project in Short Pump had gone wrong 8 months earlier. Daniel had underbid labor and materials. Then the homeowner demanded corrections after a subcontractor installed part of the kitchen improperly. Daniel absorbed the cost to protect the company's reputation. Another client delayed payment. Then a commercial project he had counted on was canceled. Instead of cutting expenses, Daniel borrowed, first from a business credit line, then through equipment financing, then credit cards. I thought the next job would fix it, he said. But the next job didn't. No. So you borrowed more. He nodded. Why didn't you tell anyone? Because I could handle it. But you couldn't. His eyes flashed. You think I don't know that? I softened my voice. I think you knew it and kept behaving as though you didn't. That hurt him. I could see it. But I didn't withdraw the words. Where does my house fit into this? Daniel's shoulders stiffened. It doesn't. You called Margaret. I was exploring possibilities. Explain the possibility. He remained silent. Daniel. He finally faced me. I thought if you could take a home equity loan or something similar, I could use the money temporarily. How much? Maybe 75,000. My chest tightened. You wanted me to borrow $75,000 against my paid-off house. I wasn't asking you to give it to me. You weren't asking me at all. I was trying to understand whether it was possible before I brought it up. Why ask whether being my beneficiary gave you authority? His face changed. Margaret hadn't told me that detail until yesterday. I wasn't asking for authority. She remembers differently. I asked a legal question. Why? He stared at the floor. Because one lender wanted to know what assets I had access to. There it was. I felt something inside me settle, not anger, clarity. And you mentioned my house. I said there might be family property eventually. Eventually. I know how it sounds. Do you? Yes. Because 3 nights ago you told me the piano would have been yours someday anyway. He sank onto the sofa. I was angry. But the thought existed before you were angry. He didn't deny it. I leaned forward. Did you tell a lender you expected to inherit my house? Not exactly. What exactly? I said I was the sole beneficiary of a family trust. I closed my eyes. Daniel. I didn't pledge anything. I couldn't. Because your father made sure you couldn't. His head snapped up. What? I hadn't intended to tell him yet. But the words were already out. Your father amended the trust years ago. Daniel stared at me. Why? Because you once asked him to guarantee a commercial loan using assets you expected to inherit. Color drained from his face. Margaret told you that too. Yes. He stood. Unbelievable. What's unbelievable? That Dad was discussing my private financial problems with a lawyer behind my back. She was his lawyer. Still, I almost laughed. You sold my property without asking, contacted my attorney about my house, discussed my future estate with a lender, and you're offended by privacy. Daniel said nothing. I took a breath. Tell me about the piano. I already did. No. Tell me why you didn't ask. He rubbed the back of his neck. Because I knew what you'd say. What would I say? No. Exactly. He looked at me. That single word seemed to strip away every excuse. Not desperation, not misunderstanding, not family obligation. He knew I would say no, so he removed my ability to say it. I thought I could buy it back, he said quietly. When things turned around. And if they didn't, I didn't think that far. That's the problem. His eyes filled though no tears fell. I was scared, Mom. I know. I have employees. Emily thinks I'm doing fine. Everybody thinks I'm doing fine. Then maybe it's time they know you're not. He looked frightened. What are you saying? I'm saying I will not pay the $140,000. His expression collapsed. I didn't ask you to. You were going to. He couldn't deny that. I will not borrow against this house. I will not liquidate investments. And I will not pay Michael the $12,500 you owe him. Mom, he wants his money back. Then repay him. With what? That's for you to figure out. His voice rose. You could fix this with one check. I felt the old instinct flare. Yes, I probably could. That was exactly why this moment mattered. I could, I said. Daniel stared at me. But I won't. He looked as if I had slapped him. I continued quietly. Your father left me a sentence I think I finally understand. He told me to help you when help makes you stronger, but never finance the part of you that refuses to grow. Daniel's face hardened. Dad wrote that. Yes. About me. Yes. He stood and grabbed his keys. So that's it. No. What else could there possibly be? You tell Emily the truth. You call Michael. You work out repayment. You speak to your creditors before they have to chase you. And you stop treating my future death as part of your current financial plan. He flinched. That's cruel. No, Daniel. My voice broke then, but I kept going. What's cruel is making your mother feel as though the things she still owns are already waiting for you. He walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned. I was trying to save my company. I know. And if it fails, I looked at my son, the frightened man inside the angry one. Then it fails. His eyes widened. And you'll survive that. He left without saying goodbye. I stood alone in the living room afterward. The piano gleamed beneath the window. For the first time, I understood why Robert had protected me legally from doing what emotionally I had always done. I knew I might mistake saving Daniel's business for saving Daniel, but they were not the same thing, and if my son was ever going to learn that, I had to learn it first. Daniel didn't call me for 4 days. That was unusual. Even when we argued, he had always found some reason to break the silence. A question about the house, a photograph of something funny, a complaint about traffic on Interstate 64. This time there was nothing. I told myself I was giving him space. The truth was less dignified. I checked my phone constantly. Every time a car slowed outside, I looked through the window. Every night I wondered whether refusing to help had been a mistake. On the 5th afternoon, Daniel finally appeared. No coffee, no phone call first. He knocked once and walked in before I reached the door, just as he had done for years. Mom. In the living room. He came in carrying a folded sheet of paper. His face was tight. Michael sent me a repayment proposal. I nodded. Good. Good? Yes. He wants the entire 12.5. He paid you 12.5. I know what he paid me. Then what are we arguing about? Daniel tossed the paper onto the coffee table. I'm not arguing. You look like you're doing an excellent imitation. He paced toward the window. The piano stood only a few feet from him. He avoided looking at it. I spoke with 2 creditors, he said. That's a start. One agreed to extend payments. The other wants $20,000 within 30 days. I'm sorry. He turned. That's it. What do you want me to say? I don't know. I did. He wanted me to say, how much do you need? The old Zoe would have said it before he finished explaining. Instead, I waited. Daniel laughed without humor. This is unbelievable. What is, you sitting there acting like none of this affects you? It affects me deeply. Does it? You're my son. Then act like it. The words landed hard. I kept my voice steady. What would acting like your mother look like to you? Helping me. I am willing to help. No, you're willing to give me advice. I'm willing to help you find an accountant. Margaret knows a restructuring specialist. I can sit with you while you tell Emily. I don't need someone to hold my hand. What do you need? He stared at me. We both knew the answer. Money. I can't believe Dad would have done this, he said. Done what? Left you instructions about not helping me. He didn't tell me not to help you. That's exactly what that letter means. No, it says not to finance the part of you that refuses to grow. Daniel finally looked at the piano. Convenient. What is? He's been dead 6 years, so he gets to be right about everything. I flinched. Don't do that. Why not? You keep quoting him like he's sitting here. I'm quoting him because he left those words deliberately. For you. Yes. About me. Yes. Daniel's eyes filled with anger. Did he ever actually like me? The question stunned me. Daniel. I'm serious. Your father loved you. That's not what I asked. He loved you more than you knew. Then why was he always waiting for me to screw up? He wasn't. Sure felt like it. I stood. Your father was proud of you. When? Your graduation, your wedding, when you started the company. And then what? What are you talking about? Daniel pointed toward the piano. That thing. I stared at him. What about it? He loved that piano. Of course he did. He loved watching you play it. He loved telling people how he found it. He loved polishing it. He loved everything about this house. His voice lowered. Sometimes I thought he loved all of it more than he loved me. The anger drained from me. Suddenly, I wasn't looking at a 41-year-old businessman drowning in debt. I was looking at the boy who used to sit beside me at the piano and bang one final note. Why would you think that? Daniel shrugged, but his face had changed. You remember when I quit piano lessons? Of course. You and Dad laughed. We weren't laughing at you. I know that now. He rubbed his forehead. But I remember Dad saying, maybe he'll find something he's willing to work at. I remembered. Robert had said it casually. Daniel had apparently carried it for almost 30 years. He shouldn't have said that. No. But he didn't mean you were a disappointment. Maybe not. Daniel looked around the room. When I was 16 and wanted money for that used Mustang, he made me work all summer. He wanted you to earn half. Everything with Dad had to be earned. Because he grew up with nothing. Exactly. And he made sure I understood that every day. I sat again. This conversation was going somewhere I hadn't expected. You think the piano represented that? Daniel gave a tired laugh. I think it represented you two. Us. The perfect marriage, the beautiful old house, Dad working, you playing music, all those stories. Our marriage wasn't perfect. It looked perfect to me. I almost smiled. If you had heard some of our arguments about money, you would feel differently. Daniel looked at me. Did Dad ever fail? The question was so simple that I nearly laughed. Of course. Not little things, really fail. I hesitated. Robert had been a proud man. There were things he had protected Daniel from knowing. Yes. Like what? That isn't my story to tell carelessly. Daniel shook his head. See, even now. What? Dad gets protected. Your father isn't here to explain himself. And I'm here getting judged by letters he wrote years ago. I understood then. Daniel wasn't only angry about the money. He felt as though he were being prosecuted by a dead man. Would you like to read the letter yourself? He froze. What? The original. You'd let me. It concerns you. I went upstairs and retrieved Robert's letter from the folder Margaret had given me. When I returned, Daniel was standing beside the piano. I handed him the page. He read silently. His expression hardened when he reached the sentence. Love him, help him when help makes him stronger. Then but never finance the part of him that refuses to grow. Daniel folded the page. So he didn't trust me. That's not what he said. That's exactly what he said. He believed you could grow by letting me fail. Sometimes. Daniel laughed bitterly. Easy for him to say. Then his eyes met mine. And easy for you, apparently. Nothing about this is easy. You have enough money to stop all of it. Yes. The honesty surprised him. And you're choosing not to. Yes. His voice rose. Over a piano. No. He pointed toward it. That's what started this. What started this was you deciding my no didn't matter. I was trying to survive. And you used me to do it. You're choosing an old piece of wood over your son. The words echoed through the room. I stood slowly. No, Daniel. My voice was quieter than his. I'm choosing my right to decide what happens to my own life. He stared at me. And I'm choosing to believe you're capable of surviving a problem I don't solve for you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel looked at Robert's letter again. His anger seemed to collapse under something heavier. I wish he'd told me this when he was alive. So do I. Daniel placed the letter on the piano. I don't know if I can forgive him for thinking this little of me. I looked at my son. Maybe you haven't read everything he wanted you to know. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? I don't know. At that moment, I truly didn't. But later that evening, after Daniel had left, I returned Robert's letter to the old brown envelope. As I slid it inside, my finger caught against something beneath the inner seam. The paper felt too thick. I turned the envelope over. There was another page inside. A page neither Michael nor I had noticed. And across the top in Robert's handwriting were 4 words that made my breath catch. For our son Daniel. For our son Daniel. I read those 4 words 3 times before I trusted myself to unfold the page. The paper had been pressed so tightly against the inside of the envelope that age had almost glued it to the lining. One corner tore slightly when I eased it free, and I whispered an apology to Robert out of pure habit. Then I sat on the piano bench. For a moment I couldn't read. Daniel's words from earlier that afternoon were still in my head. Did he ever actually like me? I had answered as his mother. Of course your father loved you. But perhaps Daniel needed an answer from Robert. I lowered my eyes to the page. Son, if your mother is giving you this letter, then something has gone wrong. I stopped. That was Robert. No dramatic language. No wasted words. I continued. Maybe you are angry with me. If so, I understand more than you think. There is something I should have told you while I was alive. When you were young, you thought I knew how to handle money because I lectured you about it so often. The truth is that I learned because I once nearly destroyed everything your mother and I had built. My breath caught. Robert had told me parts of that story, but never like this. It happened when Daniel was 5. Robert had expanded his small building supply business too quickly. He leased additional warehouse space, purchased equipment, and hired employees because he expected a large commercial contract. The contract disappeared. The expenses didn't. For months, Robert hid how frightened he was. I remembered that year differently. I remembered Robert coming home late. I remembered arguments about bills. I remembered selling a second car because Robert said we didn't need it. I had known the business was struggling. I hadn't known how close we came to losing everything. The letter continued. I owed more money than I could comfortably repay, and I was ashamed. So I went to my father. I expected him to help me because he had savings and property. He refused. I hated him for it. I sat back. Robert's father, Harold King, had been a quiet, stubborn man who died when Daniel was a teenager. Robert rarely spoke about disagreements with him. I kept reading. I told him he could save my company with one signature. He told me something I didn't understand until years later. If I sign, I save the company you built badly. If I don't, maybe I save the man who has to build the next one better. I called him cruel. Maybe you will call me cruel too. Tears filled my eyes. I knew where Robert was going. His father hadn't abandoned him. He had refused to rescue him. Robert wrote that he sold his truck and some equipment. He gave up the warehouse expansion. He worked evenings. He negotiated with creditors before they could come after him. For nearly 2 years, he lived with the consequences of his mistake. And the company survived. Smaller, healthier, built differently. Then came the sentence that broke something open inside me. Daniel, everything you admired about my discipline came after a period when I had very little. You saw the finished man. You did not see the frightened one who had to become him. I pressed the page against my chest. How many times do children mistake their parents' final form for their entire story? Daniel had seen Robert as rigid, capable, impossible to impress. He hadn't known Robert had once been exactly where he was now. I continued. If you are reading this because you tried to take something from your mother to save yourself, then I failed to teach you something while I was alive. That failure belongs partly to me. But what you do next belongs to you. I began crying then, not loudly. Just the quiet tears that come when someone you loved reaches across years and touches the exact wound you are carrying. Robert wasn't condemning Daniel. He was taking responsibility too. There was more. Do not confuse your mother's generosity with weakness. She has saved both of us more times than you know. But there are things a man must be allowed to survive without someone removing the pain for him. If your business fails, you are still my son. If you lose money, you are still my son. If people discover you made mistakes, you are still my son. Your worth was never the company. I had to stop again. That was Daniel's deepest fear. Not debt, exposure. Everybody thinks I'm doing fine, he had told me. Robert had somehow understood that pride could trap his son more effectively than any creditor. At the bottom of the page, the handwriting became slightly uneven. Robert must have written it during the final months of his illness. I leaned closer. You may be angry with me when you read this. Be angry. Then get up tomorrow and make one honest decision. Make another the day after that. A man's life can change direction through very small acts of honesty. And Daniel, you can still become the man I always believed you could be. Dad. I lowered the letter. The house was completely silent. For years I had wished for one more conversation with Robert. Now I realized he had left one behind. Not only for me, for our son. I called Daniel. He answered after several rings. Mom, I found something. A pause. What? Another page in the envelope. What page? It's addressed to you. Silence. From Dad. Yes. What does it say? I think you should read it yourself. Another long silence. I'm tired, Mom. I know. Can we do this another day? You can. I looked at Robert's handwriting. But I don't think you should. Daniel arrived 25 minutes later. This time he didn't walk in without waiting. He knocked. That small courtesy nearly made me cry again. I opened the door and handed him the letter. He didn't sit at first. He stood beside the piano and began reading. I watched his face change. Defensiveness disappeared first, then anger. When he reached the story about Robert's failed business, he sat down slowly on the piano bench. I never knew this, he whispered. Neither did I, not all of it. He continued reading. When he reached the final lines, Daniel stopped. His shoulders began shaking. I moved toward him instinctively. Then I stopped myself. Not because I didn't want to comfort him, because this moment belonged to Daniel and his father. After a while, he wiped his face. He thought I could be better. Yes. I thought he expected me to already be better. I sat beside him. Maybe that's something he should have explained while he was here. Daniel nodded. Then he looked at the piano. I really did think I could buy it back. I believe you. That doesn't make what I did okay. No. I lied to Michael. Yes. I lied to you. Yes. I was going to ask you to put your house at risk. Yes. He closed his eyes. For once I didn't soften the truth. Daniel folded Robert's letter carefully. What do I do now? I looked at my son. For most of his life I would have answered that question by giving him a solution. A check. A phone call. A way out. This time I gave him something different. You start with one honest decision. He looked down at the letter. Robert's words, not mine. Daniel nodded slowly. Then I guess I need to tell Emily everything. Yes. And Michael. Yes. And my creditors. Yes. He breathed deeply. I'm scared. I know. I placed my hand over his. But being scared isn't the same as being helpless. Daniel looked at me. For the first time since the piano disappeared, I saw no entitlement in his face. Only fear. And underneath it perhaps the beginning of something stronger. He took Robert's letter home that night. I let him, because it had never really belonged to me. And as I watched my son walk toward his truck, I understood why Robert had hidden two messages in that old piano. One was meant to protect me from Daniel's choices. The other was meant to remind Daniel that his worst choice did not have to become the man he remained. Daniel told Emily the truth the next morning. I know because he called me afterward. Not to ask for money, not to ask me to explain anything to her, just to tell me he had done it. How did she take it? I asked. There was a long silence. Badly. I'm sorry. She cried. I closed my eyes. Emily and I had never been exceptionally close, but she was a good woman. She had trusted her husband to tell her whether their family was financially secure. Did you tell her everything? Everything. The 140,000? Yes. The piano? Yes. My house? Another pause. Yes. That answer mattered. And what did she say? Daniel gave a tired laugh. Things I probably deserved. Daniel. I know. I am not feeling sorry for myself. He sounded different. Not fixed. Not suddenly transformed. Just quieter. Emily had asked him one question that hurt more than all the others. Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me we were in trouble? Daniel told me he hadn't known how to answer. I kept telling myself I was protecting her, he said. But really, I was protecting the version of me she thought she was married to. I sat at my kitchen table listening. That was the most honest thing I had heard my son say in months. What happens now? We figure it out. Not you help me figure it out. We. I noticed the difference. Later that day, Daniel met Michael Turner. I wasn't there. That was deliberate. Daniel had created that problem himself. If I attended, I knew I would be tempted to smooth the conversation. Michael called me afterward. Your son came by. How did it go? He apologized. Did he make excuses? Not many. That almost made me smile. What did you agree to? Daniel would repay the entire $12,500. Michael wasn't demanding it immediately. They created a written payment schedule with a larger initial payment followed by monthly installments. Thank you for giving him time, I said. I'm protecting my business too, Mrs. King. I'd rather have a realistic repayment plan than a promise he can't keep. Robert would have liked Michael. What happens if he misses payments? Then we revisit it. There was no drama in Michael's voice, no desire to punish Daniel, just consequences, simple, clear, adult. Daniel's next step was harder. He had to look at his company honestly. For years, he had treated growth as proof of success. More employees, more trucks, more equipment, larger contracts, a bigger office. The company had looked prosperous from the outside while slowly becoming fragile underneath. The accountant, Margaret recommended, was a woman named Susan Patel, who specialized in small business restructuring. Daniel agreed to meet her. I paid for nothing. That detail sounds small. It wasn't. I wanted to. When Daniel told me Susan's consulting fee, the old words rose automatically into my throat. I'll cover it. I swallowed them. Daniel paid her himself. A week later, he came to my house carrying a folder. I have a plan. We sat at the kitchen table. Do you want advice or do you want me to listen? He looked surprised. Listen first. So I did. Susan had gone through the company line by line. The result was painful. One part of Daniel's business, the larger renovation projects, was losing money despite generating impressive revenue. He had been taking jobs too aggressively, underestimating labor costs and borrowing to bridge gaps. Susan recommended closing that division temporarily. Daniel would focus on smaller residential projects where margins were predictable. That means letting 3 people go, he said. I'm sorry. I hate it. I know. But if I don't, everybody could lose their job. He stared at the folder. I kept thinking getting smaller meant failing. What do you think now? I think pretending I wasn't failing almost finished the job. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. That was help I could give freely, not rescue, support. Daniel also had to sell things. The first was his truck. He loved that truck. It was less than 2 years old, loaded with every feature imaginable, and far more expensive than he had ever admitted to me. When he bought it, I remember Robert's voice appearing in my head. That's a lot of truck for someone who complains about material costs. I had ignored the thought. Now Daniel sold it and replaced it with an older used work vehicle. He sold 2 pieces of financed equipment the company rarely used. He canceled the office lease and moved administrative work back into a small room at his workshop. Emily cut household expenses too. Not because Daniel demanded it, because now she finally knew what they were facing. One afternoon she came to see me alone. I worried when I saw her at the door. Is everything all right? No, she said. Then she smiled faintly. But maybe it will be. We sat in the living room. Her eyes went immediately to the piano. I didn't know he sold it. I know. I would have stopped him. I believe you. She looked embarrassed. I didn't know about your house either. Daniel told me. I'm furious with him. You have every right to be. But I'm also furious with myself. Why? Because I liked believing everything was fine. I understood that more than she knew. So did I. Emily looked at me. Are you going to help him financially? There it was. No, she nodded. To my surprise, relief crossed her face. Good. I hadn't expected that, she explained. If you rescue the company now, Daniel will learn that all he has to do is survive long enough for someone else to absorb the damage. Those words could have come from Robert. That doesn't mean I want him destroyed, she continued. I just want my husband back, the one who didn't have to lie to look successful. After she left, I sat beside the piano for a long time. Something was changing, not quickly, certainly not painlessly, but changing. Over the next 2 months, Daniel followed the repayment plans. Some weeks were ugly. A client delayed payment and he called me in a panic. I listened. I did not offer money. Another week, his old replacement truck needed repairs. He borrowed a company van for 3 days instead of calling me. Each time he solved something without reaching into my life. For the answer, I saw a little more of the man Robert had believed he could become. Then one Saturday morning, Daniel stopped by. He stood beside the piano. I talked to Michael about restoration. I looked up. Why? Because I owe you more than money. My heart tightened. You don't have to pay for the restoration. I know. He ran his fingers just above the wood without touching it. I just wanted to know what it needs. I studied him. Months earlier, those same eyes had looked at the piano and seen $12,500. Now he seemed to see something else. I think I'm going to restore it, I said. Daniel looked surprised. You are, yes. But you don't play anymore. I looked at the keys. For 6 years that had been true. Then I remembered something. Not Robert's death. Robert's life. All those evenings when he sat nearby while music filled our home. I haven't played, I corrected. That's not the same as saying I never will. Daniel smiled. It was small. But it was the first smile between us that didn't feel burdened by debt apology or fear. And a week later, when Michael introduced me to the restoration specialist, who would bring the old instrument back to life, I realized the piano wasn't the only thing in that house beginning to be repaired. The restoration took nearly 4 months. Michael warned me at the beginning not to expect miracles. Old instruments aren't supposed to become new instruments, he said, running his hand along the piano's curved side. If someone makes this look like it came out of a factory yesterday, they've erased half of what makes it worth preserving. I liked that. Maybe because at 68 I had no interest in being restored to factory condition either. I didn't want my wrinkles erased. I didn't want the years with Robert polished away. I didn't even want every scratch removed from the piano. One scratch in particular ran along the left side low enough that most people never noticed it. Michael's restoration specialist, a patient man named Thomas, pointed to it during his first inspection. We can probably reduce that considerably. No, he looked up. You want it left. Exactly as it is. Michael smiled as though he already knew why. Robert had made that scratch the day the piano arrived at our house. He and 2 friends had spent nearly an hour trying to maneuver the instrument through the front doorway. Robert refused to pay professional movers because, as he put it, I've moved refrigerators. How different can a piano be? Very different, as it turned out. The piano scraped against the doorframe. I gasped. Robert froze. His friend Charlie said, "Well, now it's officially yours." For 32 years that scratch had remained. It was imperfect. So was the memory. That was precisely why I wanted it preserved. While the restoration continued, I began changing the living room. Nothing dramatic. At first, I simply moved a chair, then a bookshelf. I took down 2 heavy curtains Robert had always liked and replaced them with lighter ones that let morning sunshine spread across the floor. For 6 years, I had kept that room almost exactly as it had been when Robert died. I had called it remembrance. Now I wondered whether part of it had been fear. If I changed the room, would I be changing us? If I moved forward, would I somehow be leaving him behind? One afternoon, while cleaning a cabinet, I found a stack of old sheet music. My hand stopped. On top was Moon River. Robert used to request it constantly. You know other songs exist, I once told him. None I like better. You have terrible musical ambition. I married the musician. I don't need ambition. I sat on the floor holding the sheet music and laughed until the laugh turned into tears. That evening I called Michael. When will the piano be playable? Technically about 2 weeks. Bring it home when it is. I thought you wanted the cosmetic work finished too. That can happen later. There was a pause. You're going to play it. I think so. When the piano returned, I didn't sit down immediately. For 2 days I walked past it. On the third morning I lifted the lid. The keys looked almost unfamiliar. I sat on the bench. My hands hovered above them. Then I pressed middle C. One note. That was all. The sound filled the room. I cried. Not because it sounded sad, because it didn't. It was clear. Alive. For 6 years I had imagined that playing again would feel like betraying grief. Instead it felt like breathing after holding my breath too long. I played scales badly, my fingers were stiff. Then I tried an old hymn. I made mistakes. I started over. By the end I was laughing. A week later Daniel came by while I was playing. I didn't hear him enter. I was halfway through a simple piece I used to teach beginners when I noticed him standing in the hallway. He didn't come into the room. He waited. That small thing touched me more than any apology. Months earlier, Daniel had entered my house, photographed my property, and made decisions about my belongings, as though my boundaries were inconveniences. Now he stood at the edge of the room until I looked at him. "Can I come?" he asked. I smiled. "Yes." He sat in the chair near the window. "You sound good." "I sound rusty. Still better than me." 7 weeks of lessons weren't enough. Apparently not. We both laughed. There was no tension in it. Afterward, Daniel told me his business had stabilized. Smaller projects, lower overhead, fewer impressive numbers to brag about, more actual profit. "Imagine that," he said, "making less money and somehow keeping more of it. Your father would have had a speech prepared." "I know." His expression softened. "I think I finally would have listened." I didn't tell him Robert would have enjoyed hearing that. Daniel didn't need another message from his father. He needed to build his own life. The idea for the music room came unexpectedly. A neighbor named Linda stopped while I was getting the mail one afternoon. She had heard me playing through the open window. "I didn't know you played." "I used to teach." Her eyes brightened. "I always wanted lessons." Linda was 72. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "I had 3 kids, then my husband got sick, then grandchildren happened," she said. "You know how it goes. You keep saying someday until someday starts looking pretty crowded." I knew exactly what she meant. "Come Thursday." She blinked. "What tea? 4 o'clock." That Thursday, Linda became my first student in more than a decade. She was terrible, completely terrible. She also smiled through the entire lesson. The next week, she brought her 9-year-old granddaughter. Then another neighbor asked if her grandson could come. Within 2 months, Thursday afternoons belonged to music again. I never charged anyone. I didn't need the money. Children came after school. 2 retired women joined Linda. One widower learned 3 chords and insisted he was practically ready for Carnegie Hall. The living room stopped feeling like Robert's preserved room. It became mine again. Ours, perhaps, in a different way. One Thursday, Daniel arrived while a little girl was struggling through Ode to Joy. He waited in the hallway until the lesson ended. When everyone had gone, he looked around at the folding chairs and scattered music books. "You've created a whole thing here." "I suppose I have." "Out of the piano I sold." I heard shame in his voice. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Turn everything good that happens now into evidence against who you were then." He looked at me. "What I did was wrong." "Yes." "You'll never say otherwise." "No." I closed the piano lid gently. "But if you're changing, then allow yourself to change." He nodded. Then he noticed the scratch along the piano's side. "They didn't fix that." "I told them not to." "Why?" "Your father made it." Daniel smiled. "I remember." "You do?" "Charlie said it was officially ours." I stared at him. All these years I had thought that memory belonged only to Robert and me. Daniel had been standing on the staircase that day, watching, remembering. He ran one finger along the scratch. "I'm glad you kept it." "So am I." That evening after Daniel left, I sat alone at the piano. I opened Moon River. My fingers found the first notes. This time I didn't cry. I played the whole song. And somewhere near the final measures, I realized I was no longer playing because I missed Robert. I was playing because I was still here. Almost a year after Daniel sold my piano, he arrived at my house carrying an envelope. For one ridiculous second, the sight of it made my stomach tighten. An envelope had started all of this. One hidden inside an antique piano. One written by a husband who had been dead 6 years and somehow still managed to protect his wife and challenge his son. Now Daniel stood on my porch holding another one. "What's that?" I asked. "Can I come in first?" I stepped aside. It was a Saturday morning in early spring. The dogwoods along our street had begun blooming and sunlight filled the music room through the lighter curtains I had installed months earlier. Daniel looked different from the man who had stood in that same room insisting the piano was just furniture. He had lost some weight. His clothes were simpler. The expensive watch he used to wear was gone. But he looked calmer. His business had survived. Barely at first. He had closed the unprofitable division, sold equipment, negotiated with creditors, and reduced his staff. For several months he worked more hours while earning less money. Then things began stabilizing. Smaller renovation jobs brought steadier margins. Clients paid faster. Daniel stopped chasing impressive contracts simply because they looked successful from the outside. He had also completed his repayment agreement with Michael. The final payment had cleared 2 weeks earlier. Michael called me afterward. "Your son paid every dollar." "I'm glad." "He was late once." I smiled. "That sounds like Daniel." He called before the payment was due, explained the problem, and asked for 5 extra days. That detail mattered more than perfect punctuality. The old Daniel might have avoided the phone call. The new one had learned that honesty often mattered before the solution did. Now he stood beside the piano, turning the envelope over in his hands. "Sit down," I said. He shook his head. "I'd rather stand." "That sounds ominous." "It isn't." He handed me the envelope. My name was written on the front. Not Mom. Zoe King. I raised an eyebrow. Very formal. "Open it." Inside was a check. I looked at the amount. $12,500. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I looked up. "What is this?" "You know what it is." "Daniel, you already paid Michael." "I know." "Then why are you giving me $12,500? "Because that's what I took from you." I shook my head. "Technically, Michael paid you. For your property. He got his money back. That's between him and me." Daniel pointed toward the check. "This is between you and me." I sat down. "I don't need this." "I know. Your business is only just recovering." "I know." "Put it back into the company." "No." "Daniel." He smiled faintly. "Now you know how annoying it is when someone decides what you should do with your money." I stared at him. Then, despite myself, I laughed. That was deliberate. "Absolutely." I looked at the check again. "Where did this come from?" "I've been setting money aside." "For how long?" "About 9 months." "You should have told me." "I thought about it. Then I realized telling you would probably end with you trying to talk me out of it." He wasn't wrong. I don't want you hurting yourself financially to prove something. "I'm not." He sat across from me. "That's the difference." "What difference?" "A year ago, every dollar was already spent before I earned it. I was borrowing against jobs I hadn't finished, invoices I hadn't collected, property I didn't own, even an inheritance I might not see for decades." His expression became embarrassed. "I lived like the future was a checking account." That was painfully accurate. Now I know what I can afford." He nodded toward the check. "I can afford that." I held it carefully. "Why is this so important to you?" Daniel looked toward the piano. "Because I need to finish what I started." I said nothing. When I sold that piano, I kept telling myself I was borrowing value from something that would eventually be mine. He swallowed. "I didn't think of you as dead, Mom." "I know. But financially." He looked ashamed. "I was acting like part of your life had already happened." That sentence struck deeper than any apology he had given me. He continued. "I thought inheritance meant Dad had built something for me." "He did." "I know. But that's not the same as saying I own it now." "No." I finally understand that. He looked around the room. This house isn't waiting for me. I felt tears forming. Your savings aren't waiting for me. That piano isn't waiting for me. You're living your life. Yes. And whatever is left someday is whatever is left. I smiled through the tears. Your father would have liked hearing you say that. Daniel nodded. I wish I could tell him. I think he'd know. For a while we sat quietly. Then I asked the question I needed to ask. Are you expecting me to change the trust? Daniel looked genuinely surprised. No. Not even eventually. Mom, that's your decision. I watched him closely. He didn't look away. The protections your father put in place will remain. Okay. Daniel, I'm serious. So am I. He leaned forward. I don't want access to your house. I don't want control over your investments. I don't want to be your trustee. I blinked. Why not? He laughed softly. Because apparently I needed a dead man, an antique dealer, an accountant, my wife, and $140,000 of debt to teach me that being trusted isn't the same as being entitled. I laughed. Then I cried. Daniel moved toward me. This time I reached for him. We held each other in the middle of the room where 1 year earlier I had wondered whether I had lost my son along with my piano. I'm sorry, Mom. I know. No. I mean, I'm sorry without anything after it. I understood. No, but I was desperate. No, you weren't playing it. No, Dad would have helped. Just the apology. I'm sorry I sold it. I held him tighter. I forgive you. The words came easily. That surprised me. Perhaps because forgiveness had stopped meaning what I once thought it meant. It didn't mean pretending something hadn't happened. It didn't mean removing consequences. It didn't mean restoring access, rewriting legal documents, or returning immediately to the relationship we had before. Forgiveness meant I no longer needed Daniel to remain the man who hurt me in order to prove that my hurt had been real. He had changed. So had I. When we separated, Daniel nodded toward the check. You're depositing that. Bossy. Learned from my mother. I smiled. Yes, I'm depositing it. Good. Then he looked at the piano. Can you play something? What? Anything. I sat on the bench. Daniel took the chair near the window. For a moment my fingers rested silently on the keys. Then I began playing. Halfway through I looked at my son. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't thinking about invoices. I wasn't calculating what anything in the room might be worth. He was simply listening. And I realized something Robert had understood before either of us. Consequences had not driven Daniel away from me. They had given him a path back. Not as a frightened son waiting for his mother to rescue him. Not as a future heir counting what would someday be his. But as a grown man who had finally learned that love could survive the word no. The following September would have been my 49th wedding anniversary. For the first 6 years after Robert died, I dreaded that date. I never made plans. I would wake before sunrise, lie on his side of the bed for a while, then spend the day pretending it was ordinary. Sometimes Daniel called, sometimes Emily brought flowers, but I never celebrated. Celebrating an anniversary alone had always seemed like setting a table for someone who wasn't coming. That year felt different. Not because I missed Robert less. I had finally stopped measuring healing by how little something hurt. Instead, I measured it by how much life could exist beside the hurt. So I decided to fill the house. Nothing elaborate. A few neighbors. Margaret, Michael, Daniel and Emily. Several of my Thursday piano students. I baked Robert's favorite apple cake and burned the first one because I forgot it while helping Linda practice a chord progression. Robert would have found that hilarious. By 4 o'clock, my living room was full of conversation. The room had changed so much in a year. There were music books on the shelves now. 2 folding chairs sat near the piano for students waiting their turn. A small framed photograph of Robert rested on a side table. Not an altar, just a photograph. That distinction mattered to me. Michael arrived carrying flowers. I almost brought you a piano, he said. Get out of my house. He laughed. Margaret arrived shortly afterward and kissed my cheek. She paused beside the piano. Still looks beautiful. It sounds better. More important. Daniel and Emily came last. Daniel was carrying a bakery box. "I thought you made cake," he said. "I did." Emily looked toward the kitchen. "I smell something burned." "That was the rehearsal cake." Daniel laughed. For a second I heard him at 12 years old again. The sound no longer hurt. It warmed me. We ate. We told stories. Michael explained to Linda why old piano soundboards shouldn't be treated like modern furniture, and Linda pretended to understand him. Margaret told a story about Robert arguing over one paragraph in our original trust for nearly 40 minutes because he hated the phrase reasonable discretion. "Your husband wanted to know who got to define reasonable," she said. "That sounds exactly like him," I replied. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, it does." Later, after most of the plates had been cleared, someone asked me to play. I pretended to resist. The truth was, I had planned to. I sat at the piano and looked around the room. For 32 years, that instrument had carried our family's history. Christmas carols, children's lessons, arguments from the kitchen, Robert's terrible singing, Daniel's 7-week musical career, then silence, then betrayal, then an envelope, and finally music again. I placed my hands on the keys. Before I began, Daniel walked over. "Wait," I looked up. "What?" He ran his fingers gently along the left side of the piano, the scratch. "You really kept it." "I told you I would." Michael looked over. "That scratch is historically significant now." "Very," I said. Daniel smiled. "I remember the day Dad made it." "So do I." He was furious. He tried to blame the doorway. Daniel laughed. "He said the house was built wrong." "Exactly." We looked at each other. For years I had thought of the piano as something Robert gave me. But Daniel had memories inside it too. Not ownership. Memory. There was a difference. And perhaps that difference was what we had spent the last year learning. Daniel started to return to his chair. Then he stopped. "Mom." "Yes." "Do you remember the song Dad always asked you to play?" I knew immediately. "Of course." "Could you play that one?" I looked down at the keys. "Moon River." Daniel nodded. "I haven't heard it since I was a kid." "You heard me play it hundreds of times." "I know," he smiled. "I just didn't know I remembered it until recently." Something tightened in my throat. "Sit down." Daniel returned to the chair beside Emily. The room became quiet. I played the first notes. My hands were steadier now. Not perfect, I didn't care. As the melody filled the room, I remembered Robert sitting in his old chair pretending he couldn't hear when I complained about playing the same song again. I remembered him younger. Dark hair, work boots, a cup of coffee balanced dangerously on the arm of the chair. Then older, gray at his temples, reading glasses, still requesting the same song. I kept playing. Halfway through, I felt someone beside me. Daniel. He didn't interrupt. He simply rested one hand gently on my shoulder. I looked up. His eyes were wet. So were mine. I continued playing. When the final note faded, nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Michael quietly said, "That instrument definitely belongs here." I smiled. Yes. But even as I said it, I understood something. The piano belonged here because I chose for it to be here. That was the lesson. Not its $85,000 appraisal, not its age, not its provenance, not even Robert's memories. Choice. For so many years, I had thought love meant giving. Give your children time. Give them money when they struggle. Give them another chance. Give them the benefit of the doubt. And much of the time, love does mean giving. But there is another side of love we don't talk about enough. Sometimes love means refusing. Refusing to surrender your dignity. Refusing to turn someone's emergency into your obligation. Refusing to allow inheritance to become ownership while you're still alive. Refusing to protect someone from every consequence simply because watching them struggle hurts you. Robert had understood that before I did. He had not hidden money inside the piano. He had hidden something more valuable. A warning, a boundary, a final act of protection. And for Daniel, he had hidden something else. Permission to fail without believing failure made him worthless. My son had lost money. He had nearly lost his company. He had damaged his marriage. He had betrayed me. But none of those things had to become his permanent identity. He had done something wrong. Then he had done something harder. He had faced it. After everyone left that evening, Daniel stayed behind to help clean. He carried plates into the kitchen while I covered the remaining cake. When we finished, he stood near the front door. "Happy anniversary, Mom." "Thank you." He glanced toward Robert's photograph. "I miss him." "So do I. I think I understand him better now." I smiled. "He could be infuriating," Daniel laughed. "So I've been told." He hugged me. "Love you." "I love you too." After he left, I returned to the piano. The house was quiet again. But it wasn't the silence I had lived in after Robert died. That silence had felt like absence. This one felt peaceful. I touched the little scratch along the piano's side. 49 years, Robert," I whispered. Then I sat down. For a moment I considered playing his favorite song again. Instead, I chose something new. A piece I had started learning only 2 weeks earlier. I stumbled over one passage, stopped, started again, and smiled. Because the piano was mine. The house was mine. The years ahead were mine. And although Robert had written the message that helped me understand all of that, the life waiting beyond it did not belong to my husband, my son, or anyone else. It belonged to me. My music wasn't over. I had simply been quiet for a while. Ketuk Fan, 15. There is something I learned from everything that happened with Daniel, and I hope you'll carry it with you. We often believe love is measured by how much we're willing to sacrifice for the people closest to us. Especially as parents, we can spend decades putting our children first until saying no feels almost unnatural. But love without boundaries can become permission. And helping someone isn't always the same as saving them. Sometimes when we remove every consequence from the lives of the people we love, we also remove the very experience that could help them grow. Daniel needed accountability more than he needed my money. I needed something too. I needed to understand that becoming a mother did not mean surrendering ownership of my own life. My home wasn't Daniel's future house. My savings weren't his future money. My piano wasn't his future possession. An inheritance is a gift that may come after someone's life. It is not permission to begin spending that life before they are finished living it. And forgiveness doesn't require us to pretend nothing happened. I forgave my son after he accepted responsibility, but I didn't change the trust. I didn't erase the consequences. I didn't write a check to rescue his business. I simply left the door open for him to become better, and he walked through it. Perhaps that was Robert's greatest gift to both of us. He reminded me that boundaries can protect love rather than destroy it. And he reminded Daniel that one terrible decision did not have to define the rest of his life. Now I want to ask you something. If you had been in my place, would you have forgiven Daniel? Would you have kept the trust exactly as Robert designed it? Or would you eventually have changed it? And do you think I was right not to save Daniel's business when I had enough money to do so? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read your perspectives because sometimes another person's life experience helps all of us see a situation differently. And if stories about family dignity, second chances, and finding strength when you least expect it mean something to you, subscribe and stay with me. Because sometimes the chapter we think is the ending is only the moment we finally begin writing our own story again. What happened with my piano taught me something I wish I had understood much earlier in life. Love is not measured by how much of yourself you are willing to surrender. For years, I believed being a good mother meant being the person my son could always depend on to make things easier. When Daniel struggled, I wanted to solve the problem. When he made mistakes, I wanted to soften the consequences. I called that love. And sometimes it was. But sometimes without realizing it, I was protecting him from the very experiences that might have helped him grow. There is a difference between supporting someone and rescuing them. Supporting says, "I believe you can get through this, and I'll stand beside you." Rescuing says, "Give me your problem, and I'll make it disappear." Robert understood that difference before I did. The greatest thing he left behind wasn't an antique piano, an $85,000 appraisal, or even a carefully protected trust. It was a reminder that my life still belonged to me. My home wasn't my son's future house. My savings weren't his future money. And my possessions weren't an inheritance waiting to be claimed while I was still alive. That doesn't mean I stopped loving Daniel. In fact, saying no may have been one of the most loving things I ever did for him. Because forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the betrayal never happened. It doesn't require removing consequences or restoring every privilege someone once had. Sometimes forgiveness simply means refusing to carry anger forever while still remembering what the experience taught you. Daniel made a terrible choice, but I also learned not to reduce a person to the worst thing they've ever done. When he finally accepted responsibility, he discovered that failure wasn't the end of his story. Neither was grief the end of mine. I thought my music had ended when Robert died. It hadn't. I had simply stopped playing. And perhaps someone listening to this needs to hear the same thing today. Whatever you've lost, whatever someone has taken from you, whatever chapter you thought had closed forever, your story may still have beautiful pages waiting. If you were in my place, would you have forgiven Daniel? Would you have refused to rescue him financially, or would you have made a different choice? Share your thoughts and your own experiences in the comments. Your story may be exactly what another person needs to read today. And if stories about family boundaries, forgiveness, dignity, and second chances speak to your heart, please subscribe and join us for the next